ball is thrown down from a certain height with an initial velocity of 3.3 meters per second. Estimate how fast it is traveling at 2.9 seconds. So the equation that gives velocity as a function of time, vt, is the initial velocity, vi, plus acceleration times time. When we're dealing with objects working against gravity, the acceleration, and it's sometimes in textbooks denoted with a g because that's a special constant, but the acceleration due to gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared. So you may see that as g in some textbooks, but really it's just a generic term. I mean, it's a specific type of acceleration that's commonly used. And the initial velocity is negative 3.3 meters per second. In this problem, I chose to make this negative 3.3 meters per second because just to highlight the fact that velocity is a vector quantity, so direction and magnitude are important. And the question says that the ball is thrown down from a certain height, so with an initial velocity of 3.3 meters per second. So taking the reference point as this height here, I'm sorry. If we were starting at like this part as the reference point, this height, and throwing it down, and this would, it's customary to use a negative sign for velocity heading in the down direction from the reference point. And the acceleration due to gravity, we know that acceleration is bringing objects back towards the center of the earth. So with that in mind, the negative sign, it would be negative 9.8 meters per second squared, which is basically telling us that the acceleration is pointing in the same direction as the initial velocity. If we were throwing a ball from the ground up into the air, the acceleration would be the same, but the initial velocity, if we were throwing it upwards, would have, and let's say it was 3.3 meters per second, the sign would be different. So I'm sorry that I wanted to just delve into that. It's always important to keep in mind what the question is asking, and especially when dealing with velocities, direction is important. So to answer the question, so basically plugging the values into this equation, we get negative 32 meters per second. Given that the question has said that the initial velocity was 3.3 meters per second, you could also, it's probably just asking, you could make the 3.3 meters per second positive, and given that the velocity is in the same direction as the acceleration, you can make that positive as well. But it's just important to keep in mind where the direction, velocity and acceleration are not always pointing in the same directions. So if an object was moving in a certain direction and accelerating in the opposite direction, it would basically be slowing down. So the correct answer to this question as it is asked is probably positive 32 meters per second, but technically speaking, it's customary for the final velocity to be negative 32 meters per second. Now, the final speed, how fast it is traveling, will be 32 meters per second because speed is a scalar term, and it's just the magnitude of the velocity, and it does not take into account direction. Something to keep in mind.